the Director of the Intelligence Bureau, the Special Director, very distinguished former directors, officials of the Intelligence Bureau and other security organizations, ladies and gentlemen. Let me at the very outset thank the Intelligence Bureau for having invited me to deliver this year's endowment lecture of the IB. The Intelligence Bureau has been absolutely critical and a key organization as far as India's security is concerned. In many matters, it acts as the eyes and ears of the government, and in probably one of the most challenging global environments, whereas the director recently just now mentioned that technology has been a great facilitator for mankind, it has also been a great facilitator for crime. Geographical boundaries have vanished. And the earlier concept that if a criminal crossed the geographical boundaries, it was difficult for any organization to investigate him because jurisdictions were territorial in character. And therefore, to have a network of international coordination and cooperation across the world has been extremely important. The professionalism, the high success rate of the operations, and the credibility of the Intelligence Bureau is extremely crucial for governance in India. On a lighter vein, if I may say so, recollecting my days in detention during the emergency, where one of the key sources of information used to be only rumors. So we were occasionally supplied information by sources who attributed the source either to the BBC or the IB. And this was reflective of the high credibility that the source wanted to add to that information which is supplied to us. I've been asked to speak on the subject of economic offenses and how that jurisprudence has evolved as the economy itself has evolved. If we look back, let us say the last 100 years or so, I have phrased it in three different phases of the Indian economy. The first was, of course, the pre-independence era, where the size of the economy was very small, the international trade was very small. Poverty was the key challenge. Getting independence was the key political objective. Austerity was the way of life. And therefore, the nature of economic offenses was entirely different. Post-independence is the second important phase where economic offenses evolved. And this was during the License Raj. The License Raj was a period where people and businesses had to be restricted. The state was the major player. And therefore, offenses were essentially offenses against those restrictions. And of course, when we emerged out of those restrictions in 1991, and when we unleashed the energies of our people, we grew into a different phase altogether. And this was a phase of liberalization, where generation of wealth also became one of the most important priorities for any society. And in this process of generation of wealth, the world was increasingly ruled by the market forces. Technology grew during this phase, and therefore the nature of offenses also has changed. And getting tuned with the nature of offenses during this phase is also one of the most important challenges that those in the security management, particularly of the economic security of India, have to face. Terrorism itself and funding of terrorism has, over the last 2 decades, become one of the most important challenges in terms of the evolving offenses. Some part of this offense is also economic in character. And therefore, smashing the sources of funding of terror and blocking those sources itself is a very extremely important challenge, which along with this liberalized era confronts us. With these few opening comments, I will now take you to what the concept of an economic offense, their definition is, and then deal with each one of these offenses through the different eras that we've seen it. While commemorating its Golden Jubilee in 1995, one of the key concomitant of the countries of the United Nations was the urgent need for international cooperation in countering transactional crime. In the 20th century, while most common forms of transnational crimes are economic offenses, the exact nature and ambit of such offenses has not been clarified in any international forum so far. While several attempts have been made to formulate a comprehensive definition for what constitutes an economic offense or an economic crime, none have proved to be universally accepted. This is because different national regimes treat economic offenses differently, making it difficult to have a uniform definition of such offenses. Notwithstanding, it is possible to draw upon certain general principles from different regimes which are instrumental in identifying and understanding an economic offense. The 11th United Nations Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice in Bangkok in April 2005 attempted to broadly define an economic crime as those activities which involved one or the other form of economic gain or financial or material gain. In the opinion of the UN Congress, economic crimes included economic fraud and all identity-related crimes except for those that did not necessarily contain an economic element or motive, while specifically noting that there was an absence of any comprehensive definition of economic crimes. The UN Congress attempted to identify key components of such crime by defining such crimes within the ambit of such offensive. Hence, for instance, the crime of fraud, which forms a part of economic crimes, was observed to have two meanings. While in most countries, legislation has limited the offense of fraud to cases where there was economic loss to victims, the term fraud and fraudulent were observed to be commonly used by officials, academics, and others to describe general conduct involving the use of dishonesty or deception, but not necessarily causing any financial benefit or loss. Instances where genuine identity information or documents are secretly taken or misappropriated without the knowledge of persons concerned were described as identity theft. Furthermore, other instances where identities were used to deceive individuals and institutions were referred to as identity fraud. The term financial crime was defined to include all crimes that are committed using the major financial systems or are committed against those systems themselves, Such crimes are observed to be closely related to economic crimes and are said to include money laundering, which forms corruption affecting financial institutions and other major crimes which are perpetrated by means of such financial structures. The term commercial crime and commercial fraud were also defined and were said to include any form of criminal activity involved in a monetary or barter transaction ranging from a large commercial dealing to small bargains at marketplaces. Although the exercise of defining various manifestations of economic offense was useful in understanding the broad features of such crime, it also ran the risk of overly fragmenting the approach to addressing of such crimes. The UN Congress also noted that while it is difficult to comprehensively define the economic crimes, the broad understanding of such crimes was captured in most jurisdictions was any action or omission that either ran counter to public economic policy or threatened the basic principles of public economic order. I'll now deal with the Indian context of how these crimes were rated in the pre-independence era as the basic jurisprudence started. The Ministry of Home Affairs, Government of India defines the economic crime to mean criminal acts done either solely or in an organized manner with or without associates or groups with intent to earn wealth through illegal means and carry out illicit activities violating the laws of the land, other regulatory statutory provisions governing the economic activities of government and its administration. While drafting the Indian Penal Code, Lord Macaulay included the crime of theft, smuggling, cheating, counterfeiting, criminal breach of trust, fraud or larceny, and misappropriation or embezzlement in economic crimes. Macaulay's motivation for including such crimes within the Indian Penal Code presents an interesting justification. The traditional economic offenses of theft, extortion, robbery, dacoity, criminal misappropriation of property, criminal breach of trust, receiving of stolen property, cheating, fraudulent deeds and deposition of property, mischief and criminal trespass are found under the chapter Offences Against Property in the Indian Penal Code. These offenses are made punishable on the ground that they constitute the violation of the right to property. According to Lord Macaulay, the right to property was a creature of law and that required the sanction of the penal law to remedy the imperfect or obscure operation of civil law over such rights. As is evident in the Indian Penal Code with notes written by Morgan and Macpherson, Lord Macaulay noted in respect of the offences against property thus: the substantive civil law in the instances have been given is different in different countries and in the same country at different times. As the substantive civil law varies, the penal law, which is added as a guard to the substantive civil law, must also vary. And while many important questions of substantive civil law are undetermined, the courts must occasionally feel doubtful whether the provisions of penal law do or do not apply to a particular act. I shall elucidate upon the nature of some of the offences as envisaged by Lord Macaulay under the Indian Penal Code for more clarity over the rationale for their inclusion. The crime of theft, for instance, as mentioned in section 378 to 382 of the Indian Penal Code, includes individual crimes of theft itself, theft in a dwelling house, theft by a clerk or a servant of property in possession of the master, and theft after preparation made for causing death, hurt or restraint in order to commit theft. As per notes of the Indian Penal Code, courts are required to have regard to the principles of civil law while ruling that the crime of theft, the most common economic offenses, essentially had no independent jurisprudence but operated as civil law matters would be. The crime of extortion, as mentioned in 383 to 389 of the Indian Penal Code, deals with the general crime of extortion, putting persons in fear of injury in order to commit extortion, extortion by putting in person in the fear of death or grievous hurt, putting persons in the fear of death or grievous hurt in order to commit extortion, extortion by threat of accusation of an offense punishable with death or imprisonment for life, putting persons in the fear of accusation for offenses in order to commit extortion with notes on the Indian Penal Code. The notes on the Indian Penal Code describe the crime of extortion like theft belonging to those classes that involve wrongful gains. Therefore, as rightly observed by Lord Macaulay, the dishonest intention to obtain property in common to both these offenses, but in theft, the object of the offender is to take property which is in possession out of the person's possession, and it is a part of this definition that offender's intention should be to take without a person's consent. The offense of extortion is distinguished from theft by this obvious circumstance that it is committed by wrongfully obtaining of a consent and not without consent. It is distinguishable from robbery by the feature that property is obtained by means of such fear of injury and does not amount to a fear of instant death or personal hurt. Similarly, offenses which he further elaborated in addition to extortion included criminal misappropriation, criminal breach of trust, on which the notes contained a basic detail with regard to the rationale behind those offenses. The Supreme Court in this regard stated that the basic principle of the 19th century penal code, said Lord Macaulay, who drafted it, was the principle of suppressing crime with the smallest possible amount of suffering. He lays this down as unassailable axiom rather than as a contention for debate. Hence, the above discussion demonstrates that traditional economic offenses under Indian Penal Code were not codified by Lord Macaulay with the intention of imposing harsh punishments on the perpetrators of these crimes, but these offenses were solely intended to punish crimes against property of a person which were not regarded as serious nature of crime against the body, but consequently not adequately deterred by civil penalties. Hence, they operated as a halfway house between the civil law and the criminal law that penalized offenses against the body. The interpretation of economic offenses, however, slated for a change after India's independence in 1947. May I, Mr. Director, continue the rest of it while